Okay. So let's start over. Good morning. And good morning to everybody who's tuning in from home as well. That's why the mic is here, not because with my voice I need the mic. I do want to welcome you. This is the first in our series of 6 Lenten studies as we move through Lent together. The way we worked it out is much like the way we did Advent. I'll be doing 2, Bryant will be doing 2, and Dana will be doing 2. We're not telling any of you which ones they are. We don't like people playing favorites. So we don't tell you who's doing which one when. How many of you got the book? I'm curious as to how many decided to get it. Whoa, good, great. How was it for the first 3, kind of leading up to today? Liked it? Okay. Good. For those of you who don't have the book, I do want to do a little bit about the introduction. And the introduction from the book, if you read, not everybody reads introductions when they open books, they go right to the first thing. But the introduction really lets you know what she was trying to achieve as she guides us through Lent and as we guide each other through Lent. So the opening words, which I thought were interesting, God works through the ordinary. Signs from God through the mundane made holy due to timing and perception. Let me do that again. Signs from God through the mundane made holy due to timing and perception. So things that we don't think anything about, right? Suddenly, because of our perception around Lent or our perception around holiness, tend to take on a whole new meaning. So you probably didn't think a lot about eating that piece of bread on the way in. For those of you who grabbed a piece on the way in, you just had your piece of bread and thought, this is great, I've got something before church. And I'm sure you're stuffed. That little half piece of bread, I'm sure you're stuffed. But we often don't see God in the mundane. And she mentions things like the note from a friend with the right words just when encouragement seemed utterly absent. Okay, suddenly you get a note or a kind word from a friend just when you need it the most without expecting it, right? And it feels like a God moment, God moving through us. It's often in hindsight that God's providence becomes recognizable and events previously considered mundane become evidence of God's presence and work in our lives. And as she says, the question for us becomes, and I think these are important questions, do we have the eyes to see God's near presence? Can we look around this room and see God's presence in each other? Can we look out here and see God's presence in what we're looking around? Can we find God's presence in the sustenance that we take in? Right? All of those things, we should be able to see God's presence in each and every one of them. Do we have the ears to hear the word of the Lord spoken in a multitude of ways and languages? Okay. What do we hear? How do we hear it? Do we hear some of the things that we hear or things that people say? Do we hear God's voice in them? I know there's some things I don't hear God's voice in, but are there other things we do hear God's voice in? And will we open ourselves to the holy, not only in heaven, but also on earth right in front of us? I often point out the Lord's Prayer, right? And we'll talk a bit about that today, because that is the scripture today. But we always say, on earth as it is in heaven, right? So it doesn't mean we're waiting for there, wherever there is. It means we're trying to work to create heaven here. And how do we create heaven here? It's by all the different things that we've learned through the gospel, all the things that Jesus taught, and that's how we do that. And can everyday objects remind us, I love this one, can everyday objects remind us, Dave, to stay awake and pay attention? I just had to pick on you. I knew I could get away with you. But do everyday objects remind us of that? Do they remind us to stay awake, pay attention, to be present, and see God in as many different things as we can see God? So with that introduction to what the Lenten study is about, I want to start out with our scripture, which is Matthew 6, verses 7 through 15. And I'm going to read 2 versions. When you are praying, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think that they will be heard because of their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him. Pray then in this way. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. And forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And do not bring us to the time of trial, but rescue us from the evil one. For if you forgive others their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. Now, that's the version we're all used to, right? We've heard that one.
There was if you don't forgive, it's not in
Right.
the ordinary sense.
And we don't say that. Yeah, we don't say that. Well, sort of. We say, as we forgive others. You're right. We don't say if we don't forgive. So the Message, Eugene Peterson's translation of the Bible, the Message says, "The world is full of so-called prayer warriors who are prayer ignorant. They're full of formulas and programs and advice, peddling techniques for getting what you want from God. Don't fall for that nonsense. This is your Father you are dealing with, and He knows better than you what you need. With a God like this loving you, you can pray very simply, like this. Our Father in heaven, reveal who you are. Set the world right. Do what's best as above, so below. Keep us alive with 3 square meals. Keep us forgiven with you and forgiving others. Keep us safe from ourselves and the devil. You're in charge. You can do anything you want. You're ablaze in beauty. Yes, yes, yes. In prayer, there is a connection between what God does and what you do. You can't get forgiveness from God, for instance, without also forgiving others. If you refuse to do your part, you cut yourself off from God's part." Did you hear that differently? Did the Lord's Prayer sound a little different to you as I read that? I think it's helpful to me because, at least for me, for learning, right? If I hear a different translation in words that maybe mean a little bit more to me, and especially if they're not something that I do by rote, right? How many of you, I won't ask you to raise your hands, but how many of us on a Sunday morning do the Lord's Prayer, and we're so proud we can recite it without looking at it, and we don't think much about what we're saying? Because we go through it. We do it every Sunday. It happens when you do something over and over again. Sometimes it doesn't mean as much. I challenged the church I was at up in South Bend one Sunday to, each week when we did the Lord's Prayer, focus on a different line. So think strongly about one line. And it may have made it so they mumbled through the rest of it, I don't know. But they said that helped because suddenly they went, okay, our Father in heaven. So I'm thinking about this. And as they went their way through each Sunday, they thought about a different line. And it was their choice which lines they chose or how they did. So, as you have gone to church, either for your whole life or however long you've gone, I'm curious, when you heard the line, "Give us this day our daily bread," what did you think of? Those that don't have daily bread. Meals. You thought of meals.
I thought of something I read about a little boy who said to his father, "Why do we have a refrigerator? We ask God to give us our daily bread."
That's cute. That's cute. I like that. A little boy that, and I'd say so they hear it up there, but a little boy that said, "Why do we have a refrigerator? Because we always ask God to give us our daily bread." That's very cute. Did anybody ever think that it meant spiritual bread? Have you thought about it that way? I actually had a pastor when I was growing up who, every time he preached about it being spiritual bread, which kind of lessened it for me, because I didn't feel like that's what was being said. For me, this is the personal part of it. If you look through the Bible and at Jesus' life, how did Jesus spend most of his time? Realize how much time he spent around food, eating and drinking with people that most of us wouldn't sit and eat and drink with, right? Feeding of the 5,000, right? All of those things, all of that food. And I really do think, as we talk about, give us today our daily bread, we do need to expand upon that. It does need to be also others. Because when we say us, you're not saying, give me today my daily bread, right?
Were the disciples always trying to figure out where their next meal was going to come from?
Yep, they often didn't know where their next meal was going to come from as they traveled along. And they actually, often were basing it on the kindness of others and kindness of strangers in many cases, people that just met. So how important is food? Very, sustains us. When working for Church World Service, we always had to do things about hunger. It was funny because when I would preach in a church, and sometimes I would have a humorous part in the thing, people would come out and say, "I knew you were going to preach about hunger today, but I didn't think I'd laugh." And it wasn't about the hunger they were laughing, it was about the situation into which we had found ourselves, or that the people we were with had found themselves, that ended up being a somewhat humorous thing. But I think when we think about food, right? When you think about food, food is not just our sustenance, right? When we have a meal at a church, more people show up than when you don't have a meal. How do you, when you have people come to your house, have you ever thought about having people come to your house and not giving them anything? No, come on over to our house. We're having nothing. Right? That doesn't happen because we know that food is not only central to keeping us sustained and alive, it's central to hospitality. Right? And her choosing bread as the first object, second object, because we had 3 days where we had dust. Any of you found any dust to look at during the first 3 weeks? I thought, boy, there's an object. Aren't you glad I didn't have dust as the first one and put them out there and say, feel free to grab yourself a piece of dust? Instead, we did bread. And focusing on items like this and starting with bread, which is central, right? Whether we have to do gluten-free or whether we just do regular bread or whatever it is that we like best, it's central. It's food. It's central to who we are. It's central to how we sustain ourselves. But it's also central to how we connect and how we care about others. Just a small piece I found this past week. It's called "There's Power in Sharing a Meal." The act of eating meals plays a significant role in the Gospels. It's important to note that Jesus shared meals with all sorts of people. There are even scholars who refer to this trend as Jesus eating his way through the Gospels. When Jesus shared meals with people, it gave him the opportunity to enter the lives of the people with whom he was eating. Many of the meals that Jesus is recorded eating in the Gospels are also accompanied by times of teaching, healing, or miraculous work. In short, we see that there is power in the time that we share meals with others. We too have the power to use our eating time to connect and share with those around us. Okay? Central focus. I want to share a quick little vignette. I ended up, for some reason, when I was with Church World Service initially, I was in New England. And I would go from church to church, so I preached in like 500 churches, just bouncing from church to church to church, which is an advantage because you can carry 3 sermons. 3, because that way you don't get bored, you know. But I also, the Metropolitan of the Greek Orthodox Diocese that covers all of New England, who now is much higher up in the church, knew about Church World Service and had given me permission to preach in Greek Orthodox churches. So in all of the United States, I was the only non-Greek Orthodox person who was allowed to preach in a Greek Orthodox church. And a good friend of ours was the pastor of one of the Greek Orthodox church not too far from us. And I have to tell you, Greek Orthodox church services, while long, are incredibly beautiful. Incredibly beautiful, the chanting and everything going on. And this story is going somewhere, you'll see. So I could go and preach. I was not allowed to take communion. Their communion is closed. Okay? It's a closed communion. In fact, if you're Greek Orthodox and you're going to St. Luke's and you now want to go to St. Christopher's Greek Orthodox Church because you're on vacation, unless you have a letter from your priest saying that you are in good standing and can take communion, you cannot take communion in the next one that you go to. Now, it seems horrible, right? However, when you go to leave the church at the end, and it's part of the service, the very last part of the service is the distribution of friendship bread. Everybody, no matter who they are, in the church who was there for the service, gets a piece of friendship bread on the way out, which the priest distributes to each person as they leave. I kind of saw that as my own communion in the Greek Orthodox Church. It felt that way. Now, I have to say that the priest himself felt awful knowing both Maureen and I that he could not serve us communion. But he also felt like this at least was a step, right? But again, how central was bread to that? Pushing away communion for a moment, bread was healing what could have been a hurt, right? I mean, it kind of feels slighted if you can't go up and do that. I mean, I've been in Catholic churches where they've told me I can't go up, at all. And it just, sometimes it feels slighted because I see it as, God's table. It's a table that welcomes everyone, but that's how I see it. That's how my theology works, and maybe I'm assuming how all of your theology work. But having the bread at the end felt significantly different to me. When I traveled overseas with Church World Service, no matter where I traveled, the best way to get to know people was when they invited you into their homes or their community and you had food. Food central to getting to know people. The poorest of the poor. Many of you have probably heard me tell the story about the time that I got 13 eggs from a family in Ghana, West Africa, when I was 21 years old, and it actually was all their food for the day. But they gave me the eggs to take with me. I will tell that whole story sometime. But to me, it was unbelievable that somebody gave me all their food for a day because I had visited them. It certainly changed my idea of hospitality. Would it change your idea of hospitality? I mean, to me, hospitality up until then was my mom saying, bring your friends over for lunch. That was hospitality. But hospitality of giving something that you don't even know you'll have again tomorrow to someone because they came to your home and because you spent time with them is difficult, right? It's difficult to deal with on my end. But I couldn't say no either because they would never have let me turn it down. And many other places that I've gone with Church World Service and trips that Maureen had gone on as well, people invited you to eat and to drink with them. It was central to getting to know each other. Often before we could talk about a project, we had to go in and have something. Sit down and have a meal or have something together. When we were in Bosnia, in a little tiny village that had been bombed throughout the war and was just beginning to rebuild, go in and they said, well, actually, we brought with us a goat. I'll just say, it was alive when we had it. And then it ended up on a large, long pole outside over a fire. But we sat and together, literally together, the group of us who were there on the Church World Service trip, there were about 8 of us, and the about 15 people who were currently coming back and living and trying to rebuild this village, sat outside cooking this goat, and then went into the only building that had a roof on it, and had a meal together. And that's how we spent time together. Every village we visited in Bosnia also gave you something. It's called rakia. Rakia is kind of like brandy, except tastes like battery acid. But they gave you that in every single village. You got rakia. And why did they give you rakia?
It's the best they had.
The best they had?
Yeah, but it was a way of sharing what they had.
What they had, okay. Anybody else have a guess on why they give you rakia? That's part of it. Because it's one thing they can make. They make it themselves from the fruit on the trees. And so they would give it to you, and they give it to you in little shot glasses. And the thing you learned is never put the shot glass down. Because if you made your way through the one shot glass and put it down on the table, it would be refilled instantly. And then our staff in Bosnia did teach us a little trick, which was, keep the shot glass. Just carry it from house to house, because you're in the same village. They don't care. So you're carrying it with you, and as soon as you step outside, you kind of do like that, which worked really well. If you drank it at every house you went to, the trip was just gone, gone completely. But again, central, right? Central.
When we were in Haiti, we visited a home,
Mm-hmm.
and they were going to offer us soft drinks, and our leader said, that's really expensive for them. And somehow she managed to have it reduced to coconut, and he climbed the tree and cut down the coconuts, and so we drank the juice out of the coconuts and then actually ate some of the coconut. But here again, it was something that they had.
Right, it was something local that they had and that they could use. Again, central. So, moving that into the faithful part of this. Can you see where God would be in each one of those moments? Even the rakia. I mean, right? I mean, I didn't ever think about those things when I was sitting there having it, that I'm gathering with people and that, God, and in fact Jesus, is in the midst of this moment as we're sharing with each other and as we're getting to know each other over this meal, over this bread. I have a question for you. Well, first of all, who here has never been to a church dinner? Who's never been to a potluck? Okay. I love the name potluck because I've gotten both. It is kind of potluck. The church I grew up in was a Reformed church, former Dutch Reformed church, and it was kind of fun because the women of the church always did the meals, and they always apportioned out who was bringing what to the potluck. So A to D, right? E to J, all of that. However, our pastor decided that one month to take it over himself, and he apportioned out the letters. Okay, so when he apportioned out the letters, forgetting it's a Dutch church, and the big letter is what? V, correct. We had so many desserts you would not believe it, because we went to the dessert potluck, because literally all we had were desserts and some appetizers, because he apportioned the letters all wrong. But again, it was a potluck. I want you to think for a moment, and I got to watch this because we started late. I want to think for a moment about family dinners. Okay, I want you to think back. Think about the family dinner, if you can think of one, that means the most to you. For which memories come back? Okay. Anybody want to share one? A family dinner that really was special?
No, not that one.
Oh, he was worried about what you were going to say.
I was thinking as when I was a child, I lived in a two-family house, my grandparents lived upstairs. And Grandma had Thanksgiving, and my cousins came up from Pennsylvania. This was in New York. And my cousins came up from Pennsylvania, and they always talk about you shouldn't put the kids by themselves, but we four cousins sat at a card table in the other room because there wasn't any more room at the big table. The youngest two got to sit with all the adults, and it was always a special time. I didn't get to see those cousins very often, and it was a wonderful time.
So the opportunity to connect with family, particularly family around your own age, was very special. And again, around food.
Well, everybody here right now, my daughter, who goes to this church, is such a kind person now, but she was a difficult teenager. And she asked us once, she confronted us once, why do we have to take time to eat all these meals together every night, every time family comes visiting? And we explained to her that it wasn't really the food, it was the time. And I said, when else do we get to sit down and hear about your day? And so the special meal that I remember is the next view, where she came to the table and actually smiled.
Yeah, because she understood now that it was more about the gathering together and being able to talk than about the food itself, right? Others? I want you to think about those. I mean, to really think about the meals that were special and that meant something.
We, I don't know, 5 years ago or so, we have a very good friend who was Jewish, and she was having a Seder. Her and her grandchildren, who were teenagers and young 20 at the time, and we were invited at dinner at a regular Seder.
Mm-hmm.
The children ran the dinner.
That's great.
They did all the talking, they did the service.
Did you find the Seder meal to be a rather spiritual time?
Yeah, because they would say prayers, they would say something out of the Torah, or so on. Very kind. Very good.
Yeah, it does. I think sometimes when we are able to move outside what our norm is, I think that makes a difference for most of us. We have the chance then to get more of a sense of something being very special, something that might be mundane is no longer mundane because it's taken on new meaning.
When I grew up on a farm in Kansas, and our church was, the clergy came maybe 50 miles to preach and spend the day and have an evening service. So we took turns having him to dinner, and that was always such a very special time. We'd eat in the dining room, not the kitchen. We'd eat with a tablecloth of our very best dishes that were not brought out even sometimes for relatives, but it was a grand occasion, and we prepared for the week in advance. What shall we eat? And we all got to set the table, and we thought about it as such an honor that he'd come to our house And it was a very, at the time that we could get to know him and he could get to know his parents.
Mhm.
People in, not parish, but the congregation.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
We,
Yeah.
You sort of might say we killed the calf.
For him. Yeah.
It was always, of course, food.
Yeah.
The question is what we ate, was what we grew.
Ha- Have some of you or many of you had points in your life where you didn't know where your next meal was coming from? You don't have to tell me. If you have, that's something to think about, right? To think about the difference now and to think about how central food was and how much it may have consumed your time, your thinking, right? Trying to get what it is that you need in order to be able to survive. I've been in many situations where, where I haven't had to worry much about my meal. Times I wish I did, so I would get a little bit less. But, I haven't had to worry about it, but I've been with lots of people who that is what they do. They worry each day as to where their food is going to come from. We do Hunger Fight, which is coming up on March 20th. We do that because there are many people who struggle to be able to put food on the table all the time, constantly struggling to do that, figuring out, do you pay rent? Do you pay utilities? Do you pay this? Do you pay that? And how do you get the food? All the choices that people have to try to make in their lives as they're struggling along. What I'm hoping throughout this is that, today, as you go, if you're going to the next service or if you're in the service, a couple of things. One, because I don't want to put you on the spot, but when you take communion and we put that little piece of bread in our mouth, what do you think about? I'm not asking you to tell me what you think about, but think about, what do you think about when you put that bread in? Do you put it in there and say, I hope it doesn't get stuck because it's a little dry piece of bread? Are you thinking about, I hope I don't drop it? Are you focusing on what that little piece of bread means? And when you think about it, this is my body broken for you, and we think about the crucifixion and the resurrection, we also need to think about it's food, it's bread. It's bread that earlier in the service we prayed about. Give us this day our daily bread, right? Us, meaning all of us. And when we look at what it is that Christ taught, and when he says, somebody tell me, what are the two most important commandments? And what's the other one? Love your neighbor as yourself, right? And on this, right, fall all the laws fall into that. And that is, part of that, loving your neighbor as yourself is not just about making sure that I have my bread, but that we have our bread. As we go through Lent and we have each object, I'm hoping that what will happen is that each of us, as we read the stories and come together on Sunday and talk about the object, that the object will take on something different for us. That the next time you pull out that loaf of bread and decide you're going to make yourself a sandwich, it might make us think a little bit during Lent of those who aren't doing that, right? Or how lucky we are to have that, or how everything we have comes from God in some way. People will say, well, it didn't come from God, I worked for it. Well, your talents and your skills and your ability to do that came from God. So everything we have in some way, right, comes from God. The things that are available came from God. So think about bread this week as you go through it. Now, those of you who don't have the book, I'm going to shortly tell you the story that's it for today. And I'll shorten it because rather than read it. It's written by, I think it's written by her actually, by Jill Duffield. And it starts out by saying, oh, it's warm. Now, you could think that's a Florida thing, but what she's talking about is she was serving communion, and an older woman came up, and she gave her the bread, and she said, oh, it's warm, under her breath, because it had just been freshly baked. And that made her move from thinking about just communion and the body of Christ the way it is, but to think about how much that suddenly meant to this woman, that she saw it differently. She's having a warm piece of bread on a Sunday morning as part of communion. And that took her down this whole path of talking about how many sandwiches she'd made in her life for her two children. She figured out it was 21,060 sandwiches, 21,060 apples washed, 21,060 chips bagged, napkins packed, with some with notes written on them, and that never once did her children say thank you? So 21,060 opportunities. And never once did they say, thank you for making my meal. The best part about this story is it then goes on to say that she comes down one morning and they're making their own peanut butter and jelly sandwich, 2 girls, and you know when you have 2 kids, what that's like, 2 girls, and they're having a conversation about what's the proper amount of peanut butter and jelly. One likes more peanut butter, the other one likes more jelly. And as she walks in, they turn and look at her and said, well, Mom, you make the perfect blend of peanut butter sandwiches. Waited through 21,000 sandwiches to get to that point, but they got there, right? That was the important point. And so then she talked about what a blessing it is, and how, and I've learned this in my life, and I'm sure you have too, how when we take the time to reach out to others, when we realize that we're praying for all of us to have our daily bread, and we take the time to reach out to provide that daily bread, right? When we do that, something comes back to us. We don't do it because something comes back to us, but it does. The most cheerful people I have ever met in every church I belonged to and every church I visited were often on the mission committee. They were often the most cheerful. You know, in fact, I've never met a mission grump. I just haven't. Because they're spending so much time focusing on the needs of others that they're getting something back. It's changing the way they see their faith, right? I think when we're mean to each other, it also changes the way we see our faith, and not in a positive way. But when we're doing things for each other and we're finding ways to reach out to those who are in need, when we're really doing what it is Christ called us to do, it changes us. It changes how we see our faith. It changes, I think, how we see the world. And taking the opportunity to do that really is an important piece for us. So I don't want to keep us a really long time today, except, and I'd like to end with the prayer that she has in the book, because it really was a good prayer, and I think it gets us to where we are. And I would encourage you, just so you know, every Sunday it will be in the chapel. We won't be in there where they have all those chairs in the circle for some reason. I think it's left over from something else. We will be in here. You won't get bread every week, but you know, I think next week might be coins. If you have coins, I don't think you want to eat them. So, but yeah, so please come each week. And as I said, it'll be myself, Bryant, and Dana alternating as we move our way through the Sundays together. And we've got 6 of them, so I hope you come back and do that. So let us pray. Lord, give us this day our daily bread, and keep us mindful of those who need to be fed. As we eat and drink, serve or are served, help us to be thankful for giving and receiving. We remember with gratitude all of those who nourish us with food, care, and support. May the daily bread we receive enable us to nurture others in your name. Amen. And thank you for being here today. I hope you, I hope you got something out of it. Think about bread.
Good job.
Is there a particular reason they don't count Sundays in Lent?
I don't know. I know they don't count it as days. It's not one of the